the Spectator, and hi. Welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I'm sure you were intrigued by A Page of Madness. I hope it held your fascinated attention. It's certainly not like many films we have an opportunity to see, and its unusualness, I think, is worthy of a lot of discussion. Before we move on to some specific topics about the film, let me take this moment to introduce today's two guests. Sitting to my left is Dr. Harvey Roy Greenberg. Harvey's a professor of clinical psychiatry at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He's also the author of Movies on Your Mind, one of the important early books on psychoanalysis and cinema. Sections of that book and some later writings will be issued very soon in a new book. Harvey is well known for his writings in a number of journals on the cinema, and he's also the film critic of Psychiatric Times, the monthly publication. Sitting over to my right is Joe Anderson. Joe is an executive in management at WGBH in Boston. He's also a man who's had 40 years worth of interest in the popular culture of Japan, and some of our viewers, I'm sure, know you, Joe, as the co-author with Donald Ritchie of the important book, The Japanese Film, Art and Industry, which has been a seminal book of information for virtually anyone in the English-speaking world who's interested in Japanese film. Joe, let's stick for a minute with the Japaneseness of this film. Two things I'd just like to initially ask you about. This film was not known as for quite a while. There's a particular story behind that. And second of all, there are always problems of translation when we're dealing with something in another language. What is this the right title? Is there something else? So first, why don't we know about this film, or what happened to this film?
Well, the film, when it initially came out in Japan, had a certain critical acclaim to it. It was not a success at the box office. But then everything was apparently lost in a fire at a studio vault, lost in a fire in 1950. And then a few years later, perhaps 2 years later, the director, Kinugasa, got a call saying that somebody had discovered the negative to this film, and why didn't he come over and take a look, pick it up, and see what could be done? And so it was only the late discovery that the film actually survived that brought it again to the attention of today's critics in Japan, and again brought it to the attention of the West.
Okay, and it's now, as the crawl on the front of the film we're saying, it's one of those films that's now grouped with the really innovative films of the 1920s. Is A Page of Madness the right title from the Japanese?
Well, translation, you know, is always a difficult thing. And the title, Kuruta Ippeiji, has very definitely two meanings, not two possible meanings, but definitely two. One is a page of madness, as we see here, but the other meaning is a page out of order.
Okay.
And this is sort of reflected in the film. I didn't see it this time. I may have blinked. But there's actually a page where the young man is seated by some manuscript paper.
Yes.
A sort of breeze blows through and scatters the pages.
Yes, yes.
Thereby, I think, confirming that other possibility for the meaning.
And certainly qualifying this film in our series Scrambled.
Scrambled
Time,
yeah. Literally, right.
Yeah,
one of the clearer images.
Absolutely. Well, what kind of cultural context does this film come out of in Japan in the 20s? Because it feels to me, you know, one is seeing it now in the 1990s, and it feels extremely fresh and modern, not something, well, but I always think of the 1920s as extremely fresh and modern. But what's the context, the Japanese context it comes out of?
Well, it's really a kind of complex context. First of all, it comes in part out of the context of certain foreign films, European films that were shown in Japan. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari certainly being one of those, but also the films of Abel Gance from the early 20s had impressed not only Kinugasa, but also some of his some literary people who were his fellow creators on this film, and indeed those films also inspired their literary works, quite apart from film.
Okay, so this film is made with an awareness of the European avant-garde that's, of the early 20s.
Yes, but not necessarily of Eisenstein. It's not clear whether he saw
What
any...
about Pabst in Secrets of the Soul?
That again is not clear. What is clear is that he did see the Emil Jannings film, the film in which Jannings appears, called Variety.
Oh, yes.
And
yes,
indeed, that becomes the beginning of this film, because his first idea for this film is that he simply wanted to make a film with an actor of the kind of presence
Okay.
and density that
And
Jannings
would he have gotten
has.
that? Is this actor well known in Japan?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
And I think he also gets it in the performance of this actor as well. And the
Would he
actor-
have seen The Last Laugh as well?
It was released the same year as this film, so it's quite possible that he saw
What
it.
about the knowledge of Freudianism, as not as it was practiced by psychoanalysts, but as it had already filtered down into the European avant-garde literary establishment?
Well, again, what's been called the German expressionist films of the early 1920s were known in Japan, and Kinugasa was interested.
Which were heavily influenced by their version of psychoanalysis.
That's right. And again, in the literary field, the work was certainly known. More particularly, the art movements of Europe at the time, specifically Futurism and Dadaism and literary expressionism were a major influence on writers such as Kawabata, who had a hand in doing the script. I think the credits are incorrect. They're clearly in documentation 4 writers of this script, and a fifth major literary influence unmentioned in the credits, and that was a writer by the name of Yokomitsu Riichi,
Okay.
whose works do have a kind of psychological states of mind aspect.
What about
to
the
them.
Shinkankanku? Is that how you
Yes,
say
yeah.
it? What about that movement as an influence on the film?
Well, that is the major literary influence on the film. That would be translated something as new sensibilities or new sensualists, in which they were dealing essentially with the impressions, the interior impressions of the characters in the stories that they were doing.
Well,
Yeah.
Harvey, you've spent a lot of time thinking about not only this film, of course, but portrayals of madness and of the whole psychiatric environment in film. How does this film fit in with those with those traditions?
Well, really quite well, and then some, in terms of the films about madness at the time. It's really, I think, in many ways far in advance of the time. The book that's really wonderful about this is by Crin and Glenn Gabbard, called Psychiatry in the Cinema, and they have essentially gone over all the Hollywood films from the very beginning until recently about madness and its interpretation. They decided not to get involved with European film, but certainly the European films of the day were heavily influenced by this kind of expressionist view. The idea of madness always gave you a wonderful access to extreme states of being. The portrayal of psychiatry, I think, in this film is a lot more accurate than you see in many other films of that day and indeed our day. The Gabbards point out that you have 3 kinds of psychiatrists: Dr. Evil, who is the mad doctor of Caligari, Dr. Dippy, who is the crazy doctor who's loonier than his patients, and Dr. Wonderful, who is Judd Hirsch in Ordinary People. But in fact, I think what you see here is a pretty good idea of what institutional psychiatry would be like at the time. The chains are off the patients for the most part, except for the really violently disturbed ones. It's a nice environment. There's a sort of pseudo-scientific and rather authoritarian aspect to things, but the sense of the mad doctor or the evil doctor or the sick doctor or the crazy doctor is not really there. You do have an authoritarian doctor,
Right.
And indeed that was basically what you had a lot of and still do. The interesting thing to me is the relationship between the doctor and the patient, which strikes me as very Japanese, very ridden with domination and submission, a lot of bowing and scraping, and the doctor being looked at almost as a godlike figure. What I'm fascinated by, though, as a psychoanalyst is the accuracy dynamically of this film in mirroring some fairly complex psychological states in its narrative, in its portrayal of the dream. A recent article in, is it Cinema Journal?
Cinema Journal, yes.
By Peterson has made, I think, too little of this. He portrays the film, it's a nice article, but he portrays the film as psychologically a little bit incoherent and very subjective. In fact, there's a rigor about this movie. What we are looking at is, first of all, the reaction of a relative to a extreme state of emotional disturbance in another relative, and all the states of morbid hope and fear and desolation that go along with it. And that is accurately portrayed. Also, a state of extraordinary grief in the husband, in the caretaker, janitor, whatever he's called, as he realizes that his wife is slipping away from him. And to me, the summit of the film is the last two experiences, one of which is obviously a dream, and the other of which looks more like a fantasy. This dream sequence, and I don't have time to go through it, is really wonderful in the sense of what dreams are all about. The dream mediates the unsuccessful escape attempt, where the man tries to get his wife to escape and horribly realizes that she wants to stay there, that as bad as the institution might be from his point of view, she feels in some way secure there or afraid of the outside world. With that embedded in his mind, is what we call in my trade the day's residue. You then have a succession of images where he tries to help her escape again, kills the doctor he was so submissive to, and then as the inmates and keepers rise up in a kind of mad dance, she's torn away from him. There's subjective impressions of a kind of funeral.
Right.
And literally, he regresses. He regresses, and up comes a whole host of perverse and strange and dissolute fantasies where he becomes the madman. You see his anger and his grief all mixed up with each other as he starts to tear at her. You get the sense of the rage at the illness, really, and a lot of other things going on, and the strange business with the bearded man who marries his own daughter. I mean, all of this is like a porridge, a psychological porridge that I think has been set loose by his regression following the loss of the wife who anchored him to reality.
Let me ask you a question as a professional reader of incoherence. That is, it's part of your. It's part of
Or
an
an incoherent reader.
But it's part of your profession to be able to find the patternings, psychological patternings, in manifestations like dreams or in behavior that to others do not look patterned. Okay. Now, I'm going to split you up for a second, Harvey.
Okay.
You're going to be two people. You're going to be the person who finds those patterns, and I think you've just explicated that sequence extremely well. But you're also a film spectator. What do you think that this film creates problems for spectators in finding it coherent? There is, I think you've explicated the psychological coherence.
Well, Freud wrote a very wonderful article that was never been read too often, buried in his papers in 1905 on psychological conflicts in the theater, and it bears telling as far as cinema is concerned. If the psychological conflicts are too explicit, then the art is lost. I would say if they're too incoherent, then indeed the art is lost. But I find, this is why I love a film like this, not because you're looking at an Oedipal drive or an Electra complex or pathological mourning, but that the film is so very artful. The man awakens and then goes into another fantasy where, having really being gripped by the madness around him and the devastation around him, he tries to put comic masks on everyone.
Right.
And ends up putting a mask on himself, his wife, and two little children, so that he in effect has restituted the family that he has lost. Now, if a lesser filmmaker or a lesser artist would have done that in a very clumsy way, and indeed it has been done, but this restitution is exceptionally artful. It has chains of evocation of other Japanese art forms, bunraku, so forth, so on. And it's that kind of artfulness that make it a wonderful film. First, we're looking for the filmic values.
Right.
The psychoanalytic stuff comes afterwards for me.
Well, let's get back to those filmic values, Joe. To what degree is this kind of aesthetic come out of a particular kind of Japanese set of aesthetic attitudes. Because this is, everybody thinks this is a film that's quite fragmentary. We have forms of coherence within that fragmentation, but there's certainly not the normal kinds of coherence we associate with the classical Hollywood cinema, with exposition, a couple of problems and solutions of problems. That's not the world of this film
Yeah.
at all.
Well, let me answer that sort of in two parts. First, going a little bit into the history of this film, because Kinugasa, when he writes about the origins of this film, he was interested in the style. He wanted a discontinuous style, and he searched for various stories that would work. And it's only when Yokomitsu suggests that perhaps he ought to give it a setting of madness to, in a sense, give it a kind of point to
Right.
hang this style upon, that the film begins to emerge. And it's perhaps no coincidence that at this time, Yokomitsu is writing short stories in which are essentially about a disranged artist
Right.
who, because of his dying wife, is unable, in any number of these stories, to have a coherent view of what this world is about. So it has almost the same structure that we find in the
these
film.
stories, okay.
So
yeah.
that's sort of one of the immediate sources of it. And then in terms of Japanese narrative, one of the major aspects of Japanese narrative is very often the lack of any complete threads that run run through the story, that here's a cause and here's
Right,
an
right.
effect, and that all that kind of reference that you might have, usually proceeding in chronological
Right.
time. But rather it seeks the more traditional vice of the juxtaposition of scenes, not necessarily for their narrative or story continuity, but because of the contrast they offer in and of themselves. There's no assumption.
The aesthetic balance as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no assumption that these things have to be somehow causally related. It's the architectonic nature of them.
In that regard, the figure of the dancer, which many Westerners have looked at as kind of incoherent, and this is what Peterson says in effect. What do you make of the dancer? I understand that has appeared before is it Yokomitsu's work?
In Kawabata's work,
Kawabata's
there is
work.
this fascination throughout his work
Yeah.
of a dancer
Do we know why?
who drives men crazy, nuts is what it is. So it's another kind of madness, as it were, and in which indeed it's interesting that the narrative, or rather the scenario, explaining that first shot where we see her dancing, something as a dancer is dancing crazily and she turns into a crazed person dancing. It's supposed to be almost a kind of transition.
Sherry, do you remember that
comes
movie,
across
Anita Dances a Vice?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
it's a very...
But I thought about it. It's very, I don't even know if you had ever seen the film. What else would you say was traditionally Japanese as far as the narrative, family structure, poignant themes of conflict, so forth?
Well, I think this, again, goes to the very basic source of Japanese narrative, to what is the basic conflict, or I should say the most predominant conflict in Japanese drama and in much of the narrative, even today, and that's the conflict between obligation and human feelings.
Desire.
Yeah. Essentially, we have a story here, such as we can pull forth, of a man who became a sailor and followed his inclination to be free, to go across the sea, which was something
And
very
that image
difficult
would
to
be
give him.
in Japanese culture as well as...
It is
that
indeed.
Ulyssian image would be in there.
It is, and it's here we see the posters for Canadian Pacific, a steamship
Right, yeah.
line,
Yeah.
and we actually see what seem to be stock shots of foreign streets there. So here's this pull. So he abandons his obligations to his wife and to his children, and then when he returns, apparently, she's crazy. She has perhaps tried to kill their child. The daughter is somehow having some kind of a problem because her mother is crazy.
Right.
So he hasn't followed this obligation at all. He has simply pursued his own inclinations, and that kind of conflict, rather than say the more traditional conflict,
I like
good
the
and bad.
I like the autumnal quality. I think that's very Japanese. Things withering away, everything disappearing. I'm fascinated by, again, sex as the supreme disturber of the status quo. I don't think you have to be Japanese to get worried about that, but in terms of all the feminist psychoanalytic work about desire, polarities, here the woman who is mad and the dancing woman share adjacent cells, the split in the man between his own image of himself and this confusion of images with this bearded satyr that keeps appearing. I thought of Galen Studler's recent work on masochism and von Sternberg in the sense of looking at this as a masochistic universe with, in her terms, a rich and flowing and fluid sense of the world, a dreamlike sense of things, endless suffering, desire, punished or deferred, that kind of
Well,
stuff.
now that brings up a question about the narrative structure of this, because one of the things we all have been talking about, we've been talking about an assumption about the sort of stability of the narrative world we're seeing. That is, it's clear who's having a fantasy, or it's clear that a lot of things are focalized through the janitor servant. There's another part of me that says not that the film is incoherent, but rather that the film has quite well-structured ambiguities.
I would agree with that.
About that.
I remember, I think it was one of the Buddhists who said, things are not what they seem, nor are they otherwise. Again, to borrow from Studler, the sense of iconicity, where things are impressively what they are, but ambiguously something else as well. And always slipping, everything slipping and sliding away from you. And I think I disagree with Peterson. I think that this is done very rigorously. Yes, he's borrowing from a variety of strategies, but I think that's the richness of the film, and at the center of it is the psychological coherence, so that you have this wonderful dialectic between a story that needs to be told and is told very poignantly, and the ambiguous means of unfolding it, so that we're always on uncertain ground.
Well, let me just say, for me at least, and then I'm going to toss this over to Joe to see whether I'm being the excessively Western viewer of this, but it's as if there's a narrative and narrator's structure we can posit here and work with. Yet at the same time, the screen of the film seems to be this fluid screen of desire. That is, at the same time, and to me, the film exists in this tension between the two. Now, am I being excessively Western about this, Jeff?
Well, I'd say we're dealing here with an artifact, and in a sense what we have seen in the film is we have seen an opera without the music, because Japanese silent films were invariably, and it includes this film, accompanied by a narrator who not only gave narrative points, but added dialogue, even where there were no subtitles.
The Benshi. Now,
fact,
Peterson says there's no Benshi in this film.
Well, there was, because Kinugasa comments on it, and the film on its initial release in Tokyo had the most famous of all Benshi.
And these guys were very well known in their own
very
way.
well known, and they were literary artists who would see a film and write an interpretation over, imposing a level of interpretation which varied from Benshi to Benshi.
Now, has that survived? Would we have a record of what the Benshi would be saying?
Not for this particular film, but it certainly is available in many recordings, since their explanations, as they were called, of films,
If you had to guess, looking at the naked face of desire, the fluidity of the film, what would the Benshi be saying?
Well, first of all, he would be probably adding what we might call more conventional narrative interpretation of this, furnishing with exposition, telling what had happened here, which is not clear here, and making that a little bit more precise in narrative terms than we're seeing here. Then he would also interpret this in terms of his own feelings, because part of the job of the Benshi, who's really descended from an oral tradition, is to witness this film with the audience and arouse their emotions beyond what we're simply seeing from the images themselves.
Work the crowd.
Right. And the other thing, in one of the comments, it's a quotation from a review of the film that Kinugasa didn't find fault with, in which he says the Benshi also added in literary terms the kinds of things which I had in the images, in the visual images. Now, he doesn't say what they were, and as I said, nothing of this seems to survive, but he praises what the Katsuben
Well-
or Benshi added to his film.
Okay, now that's interesting, because as you were beginning this explanation, one of the assumptions I made is that Kinugasa could make a film so bold because Bensi would, in some sense, help normalize the film. That is, if it was terribly strange to an audience, there would be someone there
That's
who
a nice point.
who could
I like that.
explain and in one sense or another and say, well, what was really happening here is that he's having this dream or whatever. But from the citation you've just given us, it would seem as if that the role was not so much normalizing, but complementary, at least in the record we have.
Yeah, yes, but with a significant difference here. The Benshi, or Katsuben, always came in after the film was over. There is no evidence that Kinugasa or most Japanese filmmakers at this time were in any way relying on what the Katsuben would add.
You
They
mean
were
the
trying to
film
make
was shown and then the Benshi talked?
Yes.
So it's like the play scene in Hamlet. First you have the mime and then the explanation.
No. They were synchronous. I mean, the film was shown with the explanation.
The Benshi would be talking
With the film. But
Okay.
the point I wish to make is that what the Benshi could do was generally, as far as we can see,
Right.
never considered by the filmmaker. They were
Right.
trying to
Oh, so
make
first the film
was
made.
autonomous documents. So seeing it here without the Katsuben is not...
The
Yeah.
Katsuben are not in on story conferences, shall we say.
Exactly.
They comment upon the completed artifact, the completed film.
Speaking about completion, Joe, I understand that we have not seen a completed version of the film.
No, there is, in the reviews, one scene that follows the one that we see with the servant, the janitor, in the hallway. And that's a scene of the young man that we've seen earlier, seated in that Western-style living room. And there's a large bridal bouquet there, indicating that he has, at last, married the daughter.
Okay.
Comes full round.
Completing the cycle.
So that the
then
restitution,
we
the pseudo
Yeah.
restitution, the conflictual restitution of the masks is succeeded by an actual cyclic restitution of the family.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we, of course, have got the doubling of the fiancé as a writer, as I take it, with that of the janitor, who is the man who's telling the story
Yeah.
in some sense too. So we have a double telling of the story and a double closure. The old man has come to his end of the telling of the story to himself and to a resolution that he will remain
With a wife.
with the wife
with
in the
duty.
prison in this relation, and yet the daughter is now with someone who is also a storyteller, but will initiate presumably a normal and by all markings in the film, middle-class Japanese modern marriage.
Right, and I think that's an important formal point, because as much as this is a film on madness, it's also a film on the creative act.
On
in some way.
narration and creativity.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about, speaking of that in the few minutes we have left, what about the influence on subsequent filmmakers? I thought of two things. One is the Scenes of Madness and the Pornographers by Imamura, and the other is the use of those whip pans in Night and Fog in Japan by Oshima. Was this film part of the collective unconscious of Japanese filmmakers, or did it just completely disappear and was never heard from again? And those events were accidental.
It would have to be something of a collective unconsciousness,
Yeah.
because I don't think they were that aware of the film. The film I don't think was even that widely shown in Japan when those other two films were made. But Japanese films are full of that type of pan, of Japanese silent film. So it does survive.
Why the whip pan? As I say, the only other film I've ever seen that in a talking movie that I can remember, where it's used over and over again, and to make an ideological point, I think, is Night and Fog in Japan. Why were they so in love with that particular...
I think it's in large part a formal aesthetic device, and I don't mean to, in that sense, put it down. But
would there
it's
be
an
anything in
abstract
Japanese
point.
theater to mirror that?
Because, well, it is a gesture.
It's also very frontal,
It's a
isn't
gesture, a formal gesture,
Yeah.
significant only in itself, probably without any narrative significance.
We're going to have to end without any narrative significance here, because if you'd like more information